let's go ahead and talk about Russia. I've been monitoring the situation there closely. Some mixed news out of the conflict at the geostrategic level. Let's put this up there on the screen. So at first, it seemed like we actually had some decent news that Ukraine and Russia had actually signed a deal, which was going to allow Kyiv to resume exports of grain through the Black Sea. People should remember that Ukraine is one of the largest exporters of grain in the world, and that shortage was leading to a potential and actually even realized food crisis in much of the developing world, Africa, many others that import a ton of Ukrainian grain. Ukraine, long known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union during that time. So the Russian Navy had been blockading those grain exports, and they agreed to this deal where they said that they would be allowing Kyiv in order to export that grain. What's interesting also about the deal is it highlights the changing nature of diplomacy in the year 2022. In the past, the United States would have been party to this deal, or not even party, would have been the guarantor of this deal. But because of our policy, which is don't ever meet any Russians, don't talk to the Russians, I don't even think that the president has spoken with Putin since after the invasion. There's been no high-level diplomatic contacts. I think Blinken had maybe one phone call with his counterpart over there. Well, Turkish President Erdogan has actually stepped up to the plate. He's been holding a ton of talks between the two governments, and he's really the one who brokered the deal. Obviously, that's noteworthy because Turkey is in NATO, and Turkey and Erdogan specifically probably have the most heterodox of foreign policies within the NATO alliance, and especially given they have a complicated relationship with Russia, but as of recently, they've been talking with them given what was happening in Syria, so they have a lot of high-level military contacts specifically, and actually the Russian top general is one of the people who was there whenever this deal was signed. The deal, it was set to last for 120 days, and it was going to be monitored out of Istanbul, but also staffed by the UN, Turkey, Russia, and Ukrainian officials. Now, the issue, though, is, as was highlighted there, is that, well, this deal is only a deal if there's not a military response. And unfortunately, the Russians, doing what the Russians do, let's go and put this up there on the screen, almost immediately went and hit the Black Sea port despite the grain deal. Russian missiles, hours after the deal was signed to resume Ukrainian grain exports, actually came in and fired 2 Caliber cruise missiles, which hit port infrastructure and Ukrainian air defenses, which at least brought down 2 of the others. That's according to the Ukrainian military command. But it is noteworthy because while they did not strike grain storage facilities, which is what the Turks were highlighting, they did strike port infrastructure. And it does just generally comport with the Russian strategy, not only to starve the Ukrainians out food-wise, but really in order to destroy their economy as much as possible because this is such a critical export. So it is a mixed bag in the diplomatic future for this conflict, and it doesn't inspire confidence. You know, something you and I have been saying here is like, hey, we need to have some diplomacy, but it's also not hard. It's not easy to have diplomacy if the people who are party are going to be breaking deals like this and just immediately violating it. I mean, the Ukrainians said this is a spit in our face. I think that's correct.
It's hard. It's hard to argue with that. Right. It's really hard to argue with that. I mean, it definitely puts. I mean, at the best, it puts the deal very much in doubt. And it really is a shame. There's no enforcement mechanism in this deal. It's basically,
what enforcement can you do?
What can you do? Right. It's a handshake kind of a deal. And immediately after the deal is supposedly inked and agreed to, Russia goes and does this and completely undermines it. And it's really sad, not just because obviously the Horn of Africa in particular has been extraordinarily hard hit, not only by this war, also by failed crops, in part due to the climate crisis. So they were in a very precarious situation to start with, and also because of financial situation around the world and inflation, it's cost more to import grain anyway. So this has been really devastating for poor nations around the world. And so the fact that this was immediately undermined is truly a disaster. And the other piece here, too, was Erdogan was actually hopeful that maybe this could be the first step back to the negotiating table, because you'll recall back when there were ongoing meetings and talks about a potential negotiated settlement and diplomatic end to this war, those were being facilitated by Turkey. So, Erdogan had said he hoped it would be the first step towards bringing the war to an end. This joint step we're taking with Ukraine and Russia will hopefully revive the path to peace. Obviously, that has not worked out.
Yeah, it has. I mean, I've said this, and this is the only way to look at it, which is that as they've shown in political science, the more attempts that you try to have a ceasefire. Most ceasefires fail, but eventually some of them work. So the mere fact that you're trying to sign a ceasefire can be something that indicates some sort of forward direction. But I do think the Erdogan government has done actually a pretty decent job of at least continuing the talks. It took 2 months just to get here. Maybe it'll take 2 months to get to one that actually sticks.
Yeah.
And then maybe it'll take a year in order to get to one that is further along the diplomatic process. But we should also not forget, the war is still not going well for the Ukrainians in the eastern part of the country. They haven't suffered any major losses since we last did our show, but the continuing bombardment and artillery is happening on the eastern front, and they have not made any forward progress despite massive shipments of arms from the West. Another thing we wanted to highlight and update, let's put this up there, Kaliningrad. So we talked previously about how the Russians have an exclave outside of their country. Kaliningrad, this is an old Soviet Union type thing. It guarantees them access to the Baltic Sea. Well, there had previously been a ban by Lithuania, a NATO country, in terms of rail transport of sanctioned goods in and out of the Russian area of Kaliningrad. How this is governed is very difficult, but the Lithuanians claimed that based upon EU sanctions that they could not allow the transport of these goods. The Russians were like, hey, you're preventing the free movement of goods in between our country. And this was never something that was supposed to even be on the table in the past. Lots of accusations flying between both, Russia accusing and basically threatening, saber rattling against the Lithuanians, which of course we have an interest in because Lithuania is in NATO and they have Article 5 protection anyway. So they have actually resumed the lifting of rail restrictions for the Russian exclave. I think that this matters because it generally is a soft folding on many sanctions grounds on the West. So the hardest hitting sanctions against the Russians, it's not just the financial ones, it was against their oil and gas infrastructure. And I talked a lot about before we left the natural gas, which we're about to update everybody on. But the Canadians ultimately did fold, and they're like, all right, you can have your gas turbines and even the US government was like, okay, ship them the damn gas turbines because we don't want the Germans to be cut off from the Nord Stream pipeline. So we're still pursuing this strange dual track policy where we're not actually sticking to the harshest sanctions. Like, we'll stick to them-ish, but then when the Russians are really threatened and they start ratcheting it up and the stakes of that become clear, then we fold. So we're doing this strange thing where, Russians are moving their stuff between Kaliningrad, they're getting their gas turbines, they're printing hundreds of billions of euros a day with gas and with oil. They're richer than they've ever been before. The Moscow government, not the people in Russia. And at the same time, so we're not hurting the Russian war machine, but then we're also not moving towards any sort of diplomatic solution. It's just, it's like the idiocy of the policy.
Well, I think it's a recognition that the policy has failed.
Yeah,
and so they can't publicly back away from it because they've sold their population, certainly here in the US, people are sold on like, you're gonna pay high gas prices, but we're gonna stick it to the Russians. This has not worked out at all, but they're too cowardly to actually fess up to that and say, we got to try a different route. And they certainly are not interested in pushing for a diplomatic solution, understanding that that may be unattainable right now, even if we were putting our force behind it. But the fact of the matter is we're not putting our force behind it. And so I think these little movements are a sort of subtle acknowledgement that the overall sanctions policy has been a failure. It has not bled the Russian war machine. It has not really hurt Putin ultimately. And I'm glad to see them back down here in Kaliningrad because this was a very, even though it may seem like a small thing, this was a major escalatory talking point for Putin and for Russia that he was, in state media there were really taking to their population as see how far the West is going, see how much they hate us, see how far they'll go beyond what even that they've said. And the EU ultimately decided that the transit ban only affects road, not rail. And that's what allowed the transit to be opened back up by rail to this area. So, when we covered this originally, we said this is a very dangerous situation. I think that was still very much the case. And it appears the Europeans looked at it and said, you know what, the juice is not worth the squeeze, it's not worth the risk here.
But that's why it's such a foolish policy. It's like, only by road, not by rail. Listen, either do it or don't. Because if you're not going to, some half-assed policy then what's the point? I mean, they're being half punished, but not really. They can still get their goods. They can still export whatever they want. They can still pump their gas, but oh, God forbid, some Russian guy plays in Wimbledon.
Yeah.
It's like, what are we doing here?
Those are the ones that make me really crazy. I mean, it's just like complete xenophobia it's complete theater and xenophobic theater that everyone has just broadly accepted. It's gross.
It's very foolish.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.